Alright guys, so a couple days ago the IDF launched a pretty major military operation inside of Gaza that the intention of it was to go and rescue some of the hostages that had been taken on October 7th. Now it looks like they did successfully manage to pull out 4 of these hostages, but in the meantime there are some pretty major complications, let's say, with this story, including the sheer number of Palestinians that it looks like were brutally massacred as a part of this rescue operation. There are also some things that we're going to get to here, some allegations that Joe Biden's floating pier off the coast of Gaza was potentially used as a part of this operation, as well as accusations that they used a civilian vehicle and civilian disguises to go and do this raid, which obviously would be a brazen violation of international law. So let's just go ahead and get into some of the details here, and I'll tell you guys what we know so far. So here from CNN, Israel rescues 4 hostages in operation that Gazan officials say killed more than 200. So they say the Israeli military rescued 4 hostages in a special operation in the Nusayrat refugee camp, central Gaza, that Gazan authorities said killed 236 people and injured more than 400 others. So we're looking at like close to 650 casualties as a result of an operation that at the end of the day brought back 4 hostages. So what is the ratio that we think is acceptable for this kind of a military operation? Are we saying that it's acceptable for there to be 650 casualties to get 4 people returned back to Israel? Is that what we think is a successful mission? And we'll get to Joe Biden's characterization of this mission here in a bit, but I mean, 650 casualties, guys. This is not normal. This is not normal for these kinds of operations. They say all 4 of these hostages were kidnapped from the Nova Music Festival on October 7th, and they say that they are in good medical condition and have been transferred to this Sheba Tel HaShomer Medical Center for further medical examinations. Now, I do think it's notable that after 8 months of this brutal, relentless bombing campaign, this genocidal campaign inside of Gaza that we have all seen, that these hostages were returned in good medical condition. I mean, that is a sheer, feat, if there ever was one, especially when you compare it to some of the people who have been taken from Gaza, or the West Bank for that matter, and brought to what essentially look to be concentration camps, like the one in the Negev desert that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, where some of the people returning to Gaza, after being held by Israel in these detention camps, are coming back looking like skeletons. I mean, coming back like they look like completely different people after being tortured in some of these detention camps, right? So it is notable that it looks like they're in good medical condition, right? Now they continue, they say news of the rescue came soon after Israel's military said that it was operating in the Nusayrat and other areas of central Gaza, where heavy shelling and artillery fire was reported. At least 236 people have been killed as a result of the rescue operation and more than 400 injured, again, according to hospital officials in Gaza. They say the killed and wounded were taken to 2 hospitals, the Al-Awda Hospital in Nusayrat and the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital in Deir al-Balah. In the Al-Awda Hospital, the director, Dr. Marwan Abu Nasser, told CNN that 142 bodies had been counted at this medical facility by late Saturday. 142 at this one hospital complex. And at the Al-Aqsa Hospital in Deir al-Balah, they said 94 bodies had been counted. Now, in terms of what the IDF is saying about this operation, here we got Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari saying that Israeli forces had to enter civilian areas to reach hostages, as this was where Hamas had embedded itself. He said the hostages had been locked in 2 separate apartments in civilian multi-story buildings about 200 meters or 650 feet apart, with Argamani held in a different building to the 3 male hostages. He said the IDF had received intelligence, and it looks like the US was giving them some of this intelligence, by the way, on their location beforehand, noting that hostages in Gaza were frequently moved around and that one of these hostages, Argamani, had previously been held elsewhere. Similar raids had been called off at the last minute more than 3 or 4 times due to unfavorable conditions, he added. And he goes on to say that the first phase of Saturday's operation saw the IDF target militant infrastructure with pre-planned strikes. So, I mean, keep in mind, when he says they targeted militant infrastructure, just implant that in your brain here for a second, because a couple paragraphs down, we're going to get some on-the-ground testimony from people who went through these supposed targeted pre-planned strikes. And it looks like what they actually did is they attacked a market, okay? A marketplace full of civilians. So to call this a pre-planned targeted strike on militant infrastructure, kind of a weird way to phrase that, right? Now they continue, they say Saturday was an emotional and happy day for the state of Israel and the IDF. An emotional and happy day where 200 lives were lost. They continue down here, again, with some of the testimony from people who were actually on the ground and experienced this. So we're not listening to the IDF whitewashed version of this now. It is hell on earth. On the ground in Gaza, locals described scenes of carnage following the strikes that led up to the rescue. Nidal Abdu was shopping in Nusrat on Saturday when he described, quote, a crazy bombardment hitting. It was something we had never witnessed before. Maybe 150 rockets fell in less than 10 minutes. While we were running away, more fell on the market. Now again, the market, right? Is this the militant infrastructure that Hagari was just referring to? He said, there are children torn apart and scattered in the streets. They wiped out Nusrat. It is hell on earth. Okay, let me say that again. There are children torn apart and scattered in the streets. Does this look like a targeted operation? They say another local, Abu Abdallah, said that the strike hit while people were sleeping, adding that, quote, dogs were eating people's remains. We pulled out 6 martyrs, all torn up children and women. We risked our lives to get them to the hospital. And they finish off here saying that graphic video shows many Palestinians, including children, injured with blood on their faces and clothes, and footage taken from the hospital also shows people screaming and crying, huddling over their bodies with blankets. And just to give you a short little picture of what the scenes are that they were just describing in that paragraph here, I can't show you the entirety of this video because I think YouTube would take it down, but, you know, as they just described there are plenty of children in this video with blood on their faces, people who are, you know, on the floor of the hospital because they're significantly over capacity, obviously, in the aftermath of this kind of a massacre. But, you know, again, you can see the chaos inside of the hospital with children, blood on their faces, you know, just an absolute unmitigated nightmare. Now, we also have this here from Yunus Tirawi, saying that according to 2 medical sources at this Deir Balah hospital, locals are still recovering bodies from under the rubble and searching alleys of the market for more casualties. They describe this as the largest massacre they've had to handle since the war began. So it looks like this was yet another brutal, you know, historic massacre that we are witnessing. This comes after the previous strikes that also overwhelmingly targeted civilians in, you know, the Rafah strike that we talked about with the refugee camp, and then the subsequent strike on a school inside of Gaza. I mean, it does not end. It does not end. Now, in terms of Joe Biden's response to this, here was an official White House statement that included the phrase, we commend, sorry, not condemn, I wish it was condemn. He said, we commend the work of the Israeli security services that conducted this daring operation. Anything to say about the 200 people that were killed, 236 with 400 or more wounded? Anything to say about that? No, nothing in that statement on that. We also had Matthew Miller here, State Department ghoul, with a pretty revealing, I guess you would call it a Freudian slip, but honestly, I don't really think it's a Freudian slip, and we'll get to that here. Let's just go ahead and watch this short little clip here.
They're embedded near civilians. Israel has a right to try and target those civilians, but they also have the obligation to minimize civilian harm and take every step possible to minimize civilian harm. So that
they have a right to target those civilians. Now again, you may say that's a Freudian slip. He meant to say they have a right to target Hamas and civilians are an unfortunate, you know, casualty of those kinds of strikes. But in effect, right, if we look at what Israel has been doing and we look at what U.S. support for Israel has looked like, this is really not a Freudian slip. He really means that. They do mean, okay, there's a certain threshold. We haven't reached the threshold yet. We don't know how high it could possibly go, but there is a certain threshold where it is totally acceptable to massacre Palestinian civilians in order to go after Hamas. However nebulous that kind of phrasing may sound like, right? Because typically they say, oh, well, we were going after a Hamas militant, and then there's never any evidence provided whatsoever that there was any sort of valid military justification to do any one of these strikes, right? And I mean, keep in mind, guys, the sheer level of destruction that we have seen in Gaza doesn't even really mathematically line up with the idea that every single one of these strikes was targeting some Hamas militant. I mean, there's pre-war, you know, pre-October 7th, about, according to Israeli estimates, like 30 to 40,000 Hamas militants. So unless those 30 to 40,000 are somehow able to operate inside of literally every single square inch of Gaza, then this argument doesn't really make any sense, right? They've completely obliterated the healthcare system. They've completely obliterated the education system, including using controlled demolitions of university buildings. They've attacked mosques and churches and schools and UN shelters and refugees and everything in between. The idea that every single one of these strikes is not intended to kill civilians, is not intended to make life in Gaza unlivable, but is instead some sort of a targeted operation against Hamas militants is It's a fucking lie. It's absolutely absurd to believe in that notion, right? Now we continue. Just an update here from our boy Prem on the success of the military operations used to try to go and rescue hostages. So here's the running tally of what has been happening with the hostages in Gaza, right? 105 were freed via that temporary ceasefire back in November. So that temporary ceasefire was by far and away the most successful means to return hostages back to Israel, which should maybe give you a little bit of an insight into what needs to happen right now and what should have happened months ago, okay? Hamas has been willing for months and months and months at this point, in exchange for an end to the war, an end to the genocide, and for Israel to withdraw from Gaza, that they would return every single Israeli hostage. That's been on the table for a long time. The holdup has been that Benjamin Netanyahu, because he wants to keep himself in power, he is not willing to end the war as a part of a hostage deal. So that's been the big blockade to actually getting the hostages returned. But keep those numbers in mind compared to the rest of these, right? 105 were freed from a temporary ceasefire. 4 were released by Hamas. 3 who were waving white flags were killed by the IDF. 4 Israeli rescue missions occurred, including 1 hostage that was killed, 1 soldier that was saved, 2 hostages that were saved, and during that operation, at least 74 people were killed. And then 4 hostages were saved during this operation, in which at least 210 people were killed. And of course, he adds on here that Israeli attacks on Gaza have killed an unknown amount of hostages and in Hamas captivity, and at least 36,800 people overall. And this was one of the testimonies that we got from some of the hostages that were returned as a part of that November ceasefire, is they came back saying, like, one of the main things I was scared about was IDF bombing, because the IDF doesn't know where most of these hostages were being kept or are being kept right now. And if you're just carpet bombing the entirety of the Gaza Strip, then yeah, you're probably going to end up killing some of your own hostages in that process. And I think that's part of the reason why you've had many hostage families that have been out in the streets in Israel trying to push Benjamin Netanyahu to accept a ceasefire proposal, and he's been refusing to do that. And so we move on here. From Mohammed Shahada, he gives sort of a rundown of what it looks like happened during this operation based on what we know so far. He says Israel's full version of yesterday's massacre: IDF snuck into central Gaza in a civilian truck. It looks like it was a furniture truck. Israel's Navy, Air Force, and the 98th Division then started shelling and bombing Gaza heavily to create a cover or a distraction, which is probably the bombing that we just heard from those witnesses on the ground. A vehicle transporting 3 hostages got stuck on the way, and the IDF sent all available formations in the Southern Command and the 98th Division to aid the stuck vehicle and intensified the bombing and shelling even more. And then one of these hostages, Argamani, was in a separate vehicle that made it before the others, and the IDF rushed towards the deconflicted area of Biden's humanitarian pier and were evacuated by a helicopter that landed a few meters next to the pier. Huh, that's interesting. They say 3 of the hostages were kept in one building on the 3rd floor, and Noah was in another building, again 200 meters away, on the 1st floor. So basically what it looks like happened here, at least from my reading of it, is that they got some sort of intelligence, possibly from the United States, on the locations of these hostages, and then they basically said, we're going to go in, guns blazing, and do literally whatever it takes to get these hostages back, regardless of how much damage and death and destruction we inflict on Palestinian civilians as a part of that operation. It doesn't look like the protection of Palestinian civilians was a part of this equation in any way, shape, or form, including potentially using the at least location directly next to the Gaza pier as a part of this operation. Now, this is especially ironic because we have the U.S. Central Command here coming out and saying, the humanitarian pier facility, its equipment, personnel, and assets were not used in the operation to rescue hostages today in Gaza. They're saying that an area south of the facility was used by the Israelis to safely return the hostages. And they say any claim to the contrary is false. So they're completely denying that the pier was involved in any way, shape, or form. Now, again, it's a bit of a strange claim because we have video of the helicopter that was just referenced in this tweet. I mean, if this is the pier back here, this is the pier right there, and then you see the helicopter right here, that's about as close as you could possibly get, right? So if you have videos like that, and you also have videos of this civilian vehicle being used as a part of this operation, it's kind of hard to believe this kind of a denial. Now, I'm not saying like US forces stormed in through the pier and then they went on to aid with the IDF operation. I'm not saying that. But clearly the pier was used in some way, shape, or form. At least you could say, at the bare minimum, the fact that this is supposedly a humanitarian pier, that sort of a protection status was used as a place for the IDF to run to then do the evacuation to Israel. Which again is like one of the main things that we have heard from the IDF, from the US military, in terms of criticizing Hamas and calling them a terrorist organization, is that they use Palestinian civilians as human shields. They disguise themselves in the civilian population, right? They disguise themselves amongst humanitarian aid convoys. This is part of the justification that Israel initially gave for the strike on the WCK, the World Central Kitchen workers, where they struck a bunch of civilian aid workers. Is they said, oh, we thought we saw a Hamas militant in there. And part of the reason why it is legitimately important to not use humanitarian aid vehicles or convoys as a part of military operations is because then you're undercutting the safety, the protection status that those entities are supposed to have, right? If you start using civilian vehicles or civilian outfits as a means of your military operations, then you are putting, actual humanitarian aid workers and actual civilians in jeopardy, okay? So it's very important to not cross that red line. And here you have, it looks like, the United States in coordination with Israel explicitly violating that red line, which again is one of the main critiques that they have of Hamas. Now, we also have here from Ken Klippenstein. Diplomatic cable leaked to me reveals that the Biden admin is worried about social media posts claiming its Gaza aid pier will lead to U.S. military involvement in the area, which it calls disinformation, despite the fact that the pier was paid for and positioned by the Pentagon. I mean, it's kind of just ridiculous at face value, right? This is something that happened with the U.S. military, paid for, positioned by the Pentagon, and then you're saying any allegations that the U.S. military is involved with this in any way, shape, or form is disinformation? What are we talking about here? Especially, again, when we just saw the video of the helicopter taking off directly next to the pier. Now, we also have here, like, for example, from Israeli state media, confirming that Israeli special forces used a humanitarian aid vehicle to sneak into Nusrat, where they then rescued the 4 captives. So, I mean, again, which one is it? Like, there's conflicting reports, but it seems like most of the evidence is stacking up on the side that, yes, they did use a civilian vehicle to disguise themselves as a part of this operation. Here from Kenneth Roth, the former head of Human Rights Watch, disguising combatants in civilian clothing in order to commit hostilities constitutes perfidy, which is a war crime. He also says Israel's rescue team reportedly entered Nusrat in a furniture truck that was driven by a female soldier in civilian clothes. And, if you're going to look at something like this and say, oh, well, Israel would never do that, that's something Hamas would do, right? Israel would never disguise themselves in civilian clothes to do a military operation. Let's remind ourselves, and if you don't believe me, go look it up. I had a video on this a while back. Remember that the IDF, the Israeli security forces, attacked a West Bank hospital where they killed people in their beds, okay, as they were disguised in civilian clothing, right? We all saw that happen on camera. We have the footage. So we know that this is the kind of thing that the IDF is perfectly willing to do, to disguise themselves as civilians, to engage in military activity. They do it all the time. I've also shown you guys pictures and video evidence before of them inside of Gaza using hospitals that they've destroyed as new military outposts. So, again, every single accusation is a confession. This is what we're seeing over and over and over again. Now, we continue. Because there are also allegations coming out from Hamas. Now, granted, take this with a grain of salt because I haven't seen any evidence to actually back this up. They haven't revealed any further information, but they are claiming that as a part of this operation, that the IDF killed 3 hostages, including potentially 1 American. Now, again, this is just a claim from Hamas. I have no way to prove that this is true or that it's untrue. I'm going to wait for further evidence to make a declarative statement on that. But again, it wouldn't be the first time that the IDF has killed their own hostages as a part of this military campaign. Now, again, just as a comparison for you guys on previous examples of U.S. and Israeli hostage rescue missions, right? Because the sheer amount of people that were killed, and even if the 236 dead number, even if that's a slight exaggeration, right, and it ends up being 100 or it ends up being even less than 100, that's still not even comparable to any other modern examples of these kinds of hostage rescue missions. That sheer amount of death and destruction. So here are a couple different examples from Brandon Friedman. This is from Maersk, Alabama in 2009. The rescuers were the U.S. Navy. The hostages that were rescued was 1 hostage, and the hostage takers who were killed were 3, and they say civilians who were killed, 0. We also had here a Somalia kidnapping back in 2012. Again, the rescuers were the U.S. Navy. 2 hostages were rescued, and hostage takers who were killed was 9, and 0 civilians were reportedly killed. And you can go and look at further and further, examples of these same kind of similar operations, hostage rescue operations in, chaotic and dangerous situations where they don't kill many civilians. In some cases they do, right? And I'm not going to take at face value that, as part of these operations that these numbers are 100% correct and 0 civilians were killed. But 236 with 400 additional casualties on top of that number, so 650 casualties as a part of a rescue mission to get 4 people, that's not normal. That is not normal. That's much more of a massacre than it is a hostage rescue mission, okay? Now, we continue here with some other updates separate from the story we were just covering here, but pretty similar. Again, here from Kenneth Roth. The UN Secretary General is now placing the Israeli army on his notorious list of shame, or a blacklist, for having killed more than 15,500 children in Gaza since October 7th, in, quote, a thoroughly justified step. So now Israel has killed so many children inside of Gaza over the last 8 months that they're on an official UN-designated list of militaries that are killing way too many kids. That's where we're at right now. This is still something that the Joe Biden administration is justifying. Is saying, no, this is a valid military operation, right? Nothing wrong going on here. Now we also have a response to that update here from Benjamin Netanyahu saying the UN put itself today on history's blacklist when it adopted the absurd claims of Hamas. The absurd claims of Hamas like what? That you guys have killed 15,000 children? That's not a Hamas claim. I mean, it's a claim from the Gaza Ministry of Health. It's a claim from other human rights organizations. It's not a Hamas claim, but okay. The IDF is the most moral military in the world, and no flat earth decision by the UN Secretary General can change that. No idea what he means by flat earth decision. Is he saying it's like a conspiratorial decision, I guess, maybe? But I mean, the fact that this man, one of the most notorious war criminals on the face of the planet, a guy whose country is facing, genocide charges at the International Court of Justice, a guy who is facing potential arrest warrants from the International Criminal Court, that this guy has the audacity still to this day to put forward the ludicrous claim that the IDF is the most moral military in the world. I mean, it's like, this is the kind of rhetoric you hear from Trump, right? Like, I'm the greatest businessman in the history of the world. It's like, okay, not really. I mean, is this believable to anybody at this point? It's almost like it's such a ridiculous claim that it makes everything else that you would want to claim about what's happening right now unreliable because of how absurd and propagandistic that kind of a claim is. The most moral military in the world. Probably, as of right now, no exaggeration, one of the single least moral militaries in the world. You guys ever seen the IDF soldiers on the ground posting their own brutality, their own war crimes on social media, proud of it? I mean, we've all seen this. We've all seen exactly how the IDF operates. And it's not with any sense of morality. If anything, it's the opposite of that. Now we finish off with this. Because, of course, Israel rejected the UN Security Council resolution in support of its own hostage deal offer. Now, Israel at the UNSC right now doesn't have any actual power, right? I don't believe they're a member of the UNSC right now. So that doesn't necessarily have any power, but it is kind of notable, right? That the official Israeli UN delegation is firmly against. They are rejecting what is supposedly, according to the Biden administration, their own deal, their own plan. How does that make sense? How does that make sense, guys? It makes sense if Joe Biden was lying and that it wasn't actually Israel's deal, or that there were parts of it that they completely disagreed with. Like, for example, again, ending the war seems to be something that they would have an issue with, right? And so, I mean, we're left with what looks to be, in terms of the ceasefire proposal, what looks to be another distraction attempt here. To say, look, it's Hamas that's blocking the deal, even though Israel is clearly not in favor of their own deal. look, it's Hamas that's blocking the deal. If anybody wants peace, go talk to Hamas. Don't talk to us. We're going to continue the military operation. We have no choice. That's what this reads to me like. And so it looks like, again, we have yet another massacre of at least dozens, if not potentially hundreds, of Palestinians in order to go and get 4 hostages. Now, am I, somewhat glad that these hostages are able to go back to their families? Yeah, absolutely. I think they should be returned to their families. You know what's the best way to make sure that happens? Is a fucking ceasefire deal. A ceasefire deal like the one that Israel is now rejecting, once again. That's the best way to get the hostages returned back to Israel, is to end the genocide. Step number 1. That's step number 1. But we can't even get to that point. And for the Joe Biden administration, for the IDF, for any political commentators, anybody else calling this a successful operation, the only world in which this kind of a mission can be looked at as a successful operation is a world in which the United States and Israel do not value Palestinian life. They don't value Palestinian life. You can't possibly tell me that they do when they're very explicitly, clearly stating that the lives of those 4 hostages are worth far more than the lives of potentially hundreds of Palestinian civilians. Unfortunately, that's the world that we live in right now.
Politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying